The wind howled across the Texas plains, carrying with it the smell of dust, gunpowder, and history. In the middle of nowhere, where the sky met the earth in a burning line of gold, there once walked a man whose name most people have forgotten. But those who remembered him didn't whisper his name out of fear. They spoke it with respect. His name was John "Shotgun" Collins. He wasn't a famous outlaw like Jesse James. He wasn't a celebrated lawman like Wyatt Earp. He was something in between, a man who lived and died on both sides of the law. A survivor of a time when justice came from the barrel of a gun. This is his story. Long before he was called Shotgun John, he was known as Abraham Graham. He was born in 1851, somewhere in the thick woods of South Carolina, into a poor but hard-working family. Abraham was just a boy when the world around him began to change. The Civil War tore through America like a wildfire, burning down farms, families, and futures. His parents didn't have much, only courage, a wagon, and the dream of a better life out west. In 1859, when Abraham was about 8 years old, the Graham family packed up everything they owned and started moving toward Texas. The journey was long, dangerous, and filled with hardship. Rivers to cross, bandits on the trail. But by the time they reached Texas, the young boy had already learned his first rule of survival. You don't wait for someone to protect you. You become your own protection. Life in Texas was rough. People worked hard and died young. By his teenage years, Abraham had already learned how to shoot, ride, and fight. His weapon of choice wasn't a fancy revolver like most gunfighters. It was a double-barreled shotgun. It was simple, powerful, and deadly. A farmer's weapon that became the tool of a legend. Neighbors used to say he could hit a coin in the air before it hit the ground. Others claimed he once scared off a group of bandits with just 2 shells and a glare. Whether those stories were true or not didn't matter. On the frontier, reputation was everything, and Abraham's reputation was growing fast. By the time he turned 20, Abraham had seen enough death to last a lifetime. But one night, everything changed. It started as a simple dispute, a cattle argument, a few angry words, maybe some whiskey. But before dawn, a man lay dead in the dust, and Abraham Graham was nowhere to be found. Some said it was self-defense. Others said it was murder. No one ever knew the truth. But what everyone agreed on was that Abraham disappeared that night. And John Collins appeared soon after. Changing names was common back then. If you wanted a second chance, you didn't need forgiveness. You just needed to keep moving west. Abraham Graham became John Collins, a drifter with a steady hand and cold eyes. He didn't talk much. He didn't brag. He just did what needed to be done. In the lawless corners of New Mexico territory, Collins worked wherever he could, sometimes as a ranch hand, sometimes guarding stagecoaches carrying gold for Wells Fargo. He rode dusty trails for days, shotgun across his knees, eyes scanning every shadow. Bandits were everywhere. Death was a daily visitor, but Collins had one rule: shoot only when you must. But when you do, make sure it's the last time they stand. That rule kept him alive. And soon people started calling him Shotgun John. By the late 1870s, Shotgun John Collins had become a name whispered in saloons and campfires. He wasn't the fastest gun in the West, but he was one of the most feared. Because he didn't bluff, he didn't miss, and he didn't waste words. He drifted between Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico, working for ranchers, railroads, and even lawmen when the money was good. Sometimes he hunted rustlers, sometimes he was one. The West was full of gray, and Collins lived right in the middle of it. Unlike the legends who filled dime novels, Collins didn't chase fame. He didn't have photographers or poets writing about him. He just wanted to live, and to keep his family, when he finally had one, safe from the chaos he knew too well. But history doesn't always remember the quiet ones. The ones who walked away from the spotlight. The ones who didn't die in dramatic gunfights but faded into the background, leaving only whispers behind. That's who John Collins was. A real man in an unreal time, where heroes and villains wore the same boots. No one knew it yet, but this quiet, brooding man with a shotgun would become part of something much bigger. He would fight alongside sheriffs. He would ride with outlaws. He would protect his family and bury friends. John "Shotgun" Collins was not just another gunslinger. He was the shadow of the Old West, a symbol of the men who lived by their own code when law and order were still being written, and his story was just beginning. They say legends never die, but some are simply forgotten until someone decides to tell their story again. The night was quiet, too quiet. A single campfire burned low in the middle of the Texas plains. The man sitting beside it had a new name, a new face, and a new life. Abraham Graham was gone, and John Collins had just been born. John didn't talk much about where he came from. He didn't have to. The West didn't care about your past, only what you could do today. If you could shoot straight, ride hard, and keep your mouth shut, you could survive. John could do all three. He drifted from camp to camp, town to town, working small jobs, fixing fences, breaking horses, guarding cattle drives. Everywhere he went, people noticed one thing. He never went anywhere without his shotgun. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't beautiful, but it was deadly. 2 barrels of raw justice. That shotgun became his closest friend, his protector, and eventually, his identity. In the 1870s, the Southwest was a dangerous place. The Civil War was over, but peace hadn't arrived. Men carried guns on their belts, and life was worth no more than a handful of silver. John worked as a stagecoach guard for a while, sitting high on wagons loaded with gold, mail, and dreams. The stagecoach lines ran through Apache country, and attacks were common. One summer day, outside Socorro County, New Mexico, the coach he was guarding was ambushed. Bullets tore through the air. Horses screamed, but John stayed calm. He took aim and fired both barrels. 2 bandits went down before they even saw his face. The rest ran. From that day on, people started calling him Shotgun John. Word travels fast on the frontier. Every saloon, every dusty road, every outlaw hideout, people whispered about the man with the shotgun. They said he could take down 3 men before they could draw. They said he never missed. They said he didn't smile and didn't bluff. Some stories were true, some were lies. But all of them made John's name grow bigger. He became a quiet legend, not a hero, not a villain. Just a man who survived when others didn't. In those days, the line between lawman and outlaw was thin, sometimes invisible. Sheriffs and bounty hunters often worked with the same men they were chasing. One month you might wear a badge, the next you might be wanted. John understood that better than anyone. He took jobs from lawmen who needed help hunting bandits. And sometimes, when the pay was better, he worked for the other side, protecting rustlers, smugglers, or even gamblers. To John, it wasn't about right or wrong. It was about survival. Money meant food. Money meant safety. Money meant his past stayed buried. One evening, in a border town near El Paso, a fight broke out. A drunken gambler accused John of cheating in a card game. The man drew his pistol. John stayed still. The saloon went silent. No one dared breathe. The gambler shouted, "Draw, Collins!" But John didn't move. He just stared at him, cold, unblinking, and then, boom! The sound of a shotgun shattered the silence. The gambler flew backward, his pistol never fired. John reloaded calmly, stood up, and walked out without a word. Outside, a kid watching from the street whispered, "That's him. That's Shotgun John." From that night on, his legend spread like wildfire, but legends are heavy to carry. For every man who admired him, another wanted to challenge him. Gunfighters, outlaws, and bounty hunters started tracking him down, hoping to earn a name by taking his. John didn't seek fights, but he didn't run either. He fought when he had to, and every time he walked away alive. But deep down, something began to change. He was tired. Tired of running, tired of killing, tired of being hunted. For the first time in his life, John Collins started to dream about peace. By 1880, John was living near Uvalde, Texas, working on a small ranch. He kept to himself, rarely spoke, and never bragged. Most people didn't even know who he really was. But one person saw through the silence, Tabitha Cox, the ranch owner's daughter. She wasn't afraid of him. She saw the man behind the name. They married quietly on November 1st, 1880. For the first time, John felt something he hadn't felt since childhood: belonging. Together, they built a small home. He traded his gun belt for a hammer, his saddle for a plow. Neighbors started to see him not as Shotgun John, but as Mr. Collins, the rancher. He had 6 children, a steady job. and something he thought he'd never have: peace. But peace never lasts long in the Wild West. Rumors began spreading again that Shotgun John was still alive, living under a new name. Old enemies started asking questions. Some wanted revenge. Others wanted the bounty. John knew his past wouldn't stay buried forever. The West had a long memory, and it never forgot its ghosts. He would soon be forced to pick up his shotgun one more time. Not for money, not for glory, but for the only thing that ever truly mattered to him: his family. In the West, peace was never free. And for John Collins, the cost was coming due. The morning sun crawled over the Texas hills, spilling light across the small ranch John Collins had built with his own hands. For the first time in years, the old gunslinger could smell peace. Coffee brewing, horses snorting in the stable, children laughing somewhere in the yard. But peace in the Wild West was like smoke in the wind. It never stayed long. After years of fighting, John Collins had traded his shotgun for a shovel. He raised cattle, fixed fences, and came home to a wife who believed he was just another hard-working rancher. The name Shotgun John was something he had buried deep, along with his past. Neighbors called him Mr. Collins, the quiet man who minded his own business. He went to church on Sundays, smiled politely, and spoke little, but sometimes when the moon was full and the prairie was silent, Tabitha would find him sitting outside, staring at the stars, fingers tracing invisible shapes in the air, as if holding a gun that wasn't there. She never asked what haunted him, and he never told her. One hot summer afternoon, two strangers rode into town. They were loud, drunk, and full of stories. At the saloon, someone heard one of them mention a name that hadn't been spoken in years. "Ever heard of Shotgun John Collins?" The man laughed. "They say he's still alive, living under a fake name down near Uvalde." The room went silent. A few men looked at each other. Every small town had its secrets, and they all knew who lived a few miles out on the edge of town. By nightfall, that rumor was already halfway to the border. 2 weeks later, 3 riders appeared on the horizon near John's ranch. They weren't neighbors and they weren't lost. They were bounty hunters, men who made a living dragging ghosts back into the light. They came with posters, stories, and greed. The wanted sheet was old, faded, and half torn, but the name was clear enough: John Shotgun Collins, armed, dangerous, wanted for questioning and multiple killings. When the hunters reached his fence, John was already there, waiting. He didn't have his shotgun, not yet. Just a calm voice. "You boys got the wrong man," he said. But the one in front grinned. "Maybe, maybe not. Either way, we'll get paid." John's jaw tightened. That old familiar heat, the one he'd buried years ago, began to rise again. He told them once more to leave. They laughed. Then one reached for his gun. Boom! The sound split the quiet morning like thunder. A single warning shot blew the man's hat clean off his head. The riders froze. John still held the shotgun steady, smoke drifting from the barrel. "I don't miss," he said quietly. "Next one won't be a warning." They backed off, muttering curses, and rode away. But he knew they wouldn't be the last. That night, John sat at the kitchen table with Tabitha. He didn't eat, didn't speak. He just stared at the shotgun lying across his lap. Tabitha placed her hand on his. "You said that life was behind you," she whispered. John looked at her with tired eyes. "It was," he said softly. "But the past doesn't die out here. It just waits for you to open the door." He stood up, kissed her forehead, and went out into the dark. The old outlaw had returned. A few days later, the Uvalde sheriff came riding out to the ranch. He wasn't there to arrest John, quite the opposite. Trouble was brewing near the border. Bandits raiding farms, stealing cattle, shooting anyone who got in the way. The sheriff had heard what happened with the bounty hunters. He also knew the stories. "I could use a man like you," he said. John shook his head. "I'm done fighting." The sheriff tipped his hat. "Maybe, but the fight's not done with you." He rode away, leaving John alone with his thoughts. The next morning, the old shotgun was gone from the wall. John rode out at dawn. Same saddle, same shotgun, same silence. But something was different this time. He wasn't fighting for money. He wasn't fighting for pride. He was fighting to protect the land, his people, his family. When he reached the border, the sheriff's posse was waiting. Dozens of men, nervous and inexperienced. They looked to John for guidance, not orders. And for the first time, He gave them both. They tracked the raiders for 2 days across the dry hills of West Texas. On the third night, they found them, 10 men camped in a canyon, drunk and laughing over stolen cattle. John gave the signal. Then, in a flash of fire and thunder, the quiet man became Shotgun John once again. Gunfire echoed through the rocks. John moved like a ghost, calm, focused, unstoppable. 2 blasts from his shotgun dropped the first pair of bandits. The rest panicked, firing wild. When the smoke cleared, the raiders were gone. Not one of John's men had fallen. The sheriff looked at him in disbelief. "Thought you said you were done." John reloaded slowly. "I am," he said. "Now I am." When he rode home, his children ran to meet him. Tabitha stood in the doorway, tears in her eyes, knowing that every man has 2 lives, the one he lives and the one he tries to forget. John Collins had finally balanced both, the outlaw and the lawman, the sinner and the savior. For a while the land was quiet again. But deep inside he knew the story wasn't over. Because men like Shotgun John never truly escape the legend. They just wait for it to catch up. He thought the war was over. But in the West, every sunrise carried a new fight. And for John Collins, the greatest battle was yet to come. The sun was low over the Texas hills, painting the sky in colors of blood and gold. The fight at Devil's Canyon was over, but the story had only just begun. In every saloon from Uvalde to El Paso, men spoke of the quiet rancher who faced 10 bandits and rode home without a scratch. They called him brave. They called him a hero. But John Collins didn't feel like one. At home, Tabitha saw the change in him again. The faraway look in his eyes. The way he'd sit by the fire with that old shotgun resting across his knees. She knew the man she'd married was slipping back into the one she thought she'd buried. He wasn't proud of what he'd done. He was haunted by it. Word of Shotgun John began to travel faster than the wind. Ranchers told the tale of a man who stood against bandits when no one else would. Drifters swore they saw him out on the trail, protecting wagons or chasing raiders. Some said he worked for the law again. Others claimed he'd gone back to outlaw ways. Every man who told the story changed it just a little, and with each retelling, John Collins became less of a man and more of a myth. But for John, the truth was simple. He was tired. Tired of killing. Tired of hiding. Tired of being someone the world could never understand. He started turning down jobs, keeping to himself, fixing his fences, and trying to forget. But peace in the West was fragile. It didn't take long for another storm to find him. One afternoon, a group of young men came riding up to his ranch. They were barely old enough to shave, but their belts were heavy with pistols. They had fire in their eyes and foolish courage in their hearts. The leader, a cocky kid with a scar across his cheek, dismounted and called out, "We're looking for Shotgun John Collins. We heard he's the fastest man in Texas." John stepped out of the barn, wiping sweat from his brow. He didn't say a word. The kid smirked. "They say you can take down 3 men before they draw." "I don't believe it. Care to prove it?" For a moment, the air went still. Only the wind moved. John looked at the boy, then at the others behind him. Eager, nervous, waiting for something dramatic to happen. He sighed. "I'm not that man anymore," he said quietly. The kid laughed. "Guess the stories were lies then." He turned to leave, but the sound of a hammer clicking stopped him cold. John hadn't drawn his gun. He didn't need to. The boy's own revolver had cocked by accident, trembling in his hand. John stepped forward slowly, took the pistol, and unloaded it. "Go home, son," he said softly. "Don't let stories make you stupid." The young men left without a word. The scarred one never forgot the look in John's eyes. Not anger, not fear, just sorrow. That night, Tabitha sat beside him at the table. "You can't keep living like this," she said gently. "You can't run from your name." John looked down at his hands, rough and scarred. "I'm not running," he said. "I'm just trying to make sure my children don't grow up with a gun in their hands." But the world didn't care about his wishes. The West was changing. Railroads were coming, towns were growing, and lawmen were trying to turn legends into history. To them, men like John Collins were reminders of the old, bloody ways, men who needed to disappear. One morning, a letter arrived from a U.S. Marshal in New Mexico. It wasn't a threat. It was an invitation, a plea for help. Bandits were terrorizing the mining routes, and the Marshal remembered Collins' reputation from years before. John read the letter twice, folded it carefully, and said nothing. For days he worked the ranch like usual, but inside something was stirring. The part of him that couldn't walk away from trouble. The part that still believed some fights were worth having. A week later, he told Tabitha he was leaving for a while. She didn't cry. She just nodded, like she'd been expecting it. "Promise me," she whispered. "You'll come back." He kissed her forehead. "I always do," he said. And just like that, the old shotgun came off the wall once more. The quiet rancher became the wandering lawman again. When he arrived in New Mexico, the townsfolk recognized him instantly. The gray hair, the steady eyes, the calm voice. They had heard the name Shotgun John in stories passed down for years. The marshal greeted him like an old friend. "Didn't think I'd ever see you again," he said. John smiled faintly. "You probably won't after this." Together, they rode into the desert, following the trail of bandits who had stolen from miners and murdered settlers. It was a long, hot pursuit that ended in a place the locals called Dry Creek Pass. As the sun fell behind the mountains, gunfire echoed across the valley. Dust and smoke filled the air. And when the noise finally died, John Collins stood alone among the fallen, his shotgun empty, his breath heavy. The marshal rode up minutes later, his men trailing behind. "You did it again," he said, shaking his head. John looked out at the horizon, his face lit by the dying light. "No," he whispered. "I just did what had to be done." When he returned home weeks later, the world already knew. The legend had grown again. Newspapers printed his name. Strangers stopped him in the street. To them, he was a hero. To John, he was just a man trying to survive in a world that wouldn't let him rest. He sat on the porch that night, watching the stars. The wind was quiet. The land was calm. And for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, peace had found him again. The sun burned hot over New Mexico. The land was dry, empty and silent, except for the echo of John Collins' name. Everywhere he went, people whispered stories about him. Some called him a savior, some called him a killer, but no one called him ordinary. When he stopped at a saloon, strangers offered to buy him drinks. When he passed through towns, mothers pulled their children inside. He couldn't tell which one hurt more, the fear or the fame. John never asked for attention. He didn't care about the glory or the gold, but legends once born don't ask permission. They grow on their own, and his was growing faster than ever. One evening, while staying in a dusty border town, John met an old friend, Tom Ackers, a man he'd once ridden with years ago when both had been younger, wilder, and not yet broken by time. They shared drinks and old stories. For a while, it felt like the past had softened, but the past never softens. Tom wasn't there for memories. He was there for money. He'd fallen in with a gang, smugglers who wanted to move stolen gold through the desert. And they wanted John to help. "You know these lands better than anyone," Tom said, grinning. "One more job, partner. Easy money. In and out." John stared into his drink. "I'm done with that life." Tom's grin faded. "Come on, John, you've still got the fire. I can see it. You can't hide it." But John didn't answer. He just stood, left a few coins on the table, and walked out. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. 2 nights later, John woke to shouting. Flames lit the horizon. His neighbor's ranch was on fire. He grabbed his shotgun and rode out fast, the wind whipping through the dark. When he arrived, the scene was chaos. Horses screaming, fences burning, gunshots in the distance. He fired twice, scattering the raiders, and helped pull the family to safety. When the smoke cleared, one of the dead bandits lay face down in the dirt. John turned the body over and froze. It was Tom Ackers. The next morning, the sheriff arrived. He didn't need an explanation. The truth was written all over John's face. But rumors travel faster than the law. By sunset, people were whispering that Shotgun John had turned on his own gang. Others said he'd gone mad and killed for revenge. The newspapers loved it. They painted him as a dark legend, a man who brought death wherever he went. John didn't argue. He didn't even try to defend himself. He just packed up his gear, kissed Tabitha goodbye, and rode out alone. For months, he wandered the borderlands, a ghost chasing silence. He helped ranchers fight off thieves, guided settlers through dangerous trails, and once even saved a sheriff's son from a gang of drifters. But no matter what good he did, the shadow followed him. Shotgun John wasn't a man anymore. He was a story, and stories are never free. One night he sat by his campfire, turning an old coin in his fingers, a coin Tom had once given him. The fire crackled softly, the desert wind whispering through the rocks. He remembered their laughter, their youth, the choices they'd made. He remembered the promise they'd once shared. No matter what happens, we die on the same side. But that promise had burned like everything else. John stared into the flames and whispered, "I'm sorry, Tom." Then he dropped the coin into the fire. Weeks later, he rode into a mining town called San Felipe, hoping to rest and disappear again. But the town was in trouble. A corrupt sheriff and his hired guns ruled it, taking money from the miners and leaving bodies in the street. When John walked through town, people turned their eyes away, not from fear of him, but from fear of what might happen if he stayed. That night, a young miner named Eli approached him. Barely 20, his hands were shaking. "Mr. Collins," he said quietly, "they've taken my brother." He stood up to the sheriff. "Please, help us." John looked at the boy. He saw in him the same fire that once burned in himself, the same fire that had destroyed everything he'd loved. He didn't want to get involved. He wanted to ride away, but something inside wouldn't let him. The next morning, when the sun rose over San Felipe, the sheriff's men were waiting. And walking down the main street, calm as stone, was John Collins, shotgun in hand, coat flapping in the wind. No one spoke. No one moved. Then, in the blink of an eye, everything exploded. Gunfire echoed off the wooden walls. Dust filled the air. When it was over, the sheriff's gang lay broken, their leader sprawled across the porch of his own jailhouse. John dropped his shotgun, breathing hard. "You've got your town back," he told the miners. "Keep it that way." Eli stared at him in awe. "You're a hero," he said. John shook his head slowly. "No, heroes don't have to bury their friends." He climbed onto his horse and rode off, leaving San Felipe behind. That night, the people of San Felipe celebrated. They told stories about the gray-haired man with the shotgun, the one who cleaned up their town in a single day. And so the legend grew again. But somewhere out in the desert, the real John Collins sat under the stars, alone with the truth. He wasn't proud. He wasn't happy. He was just tired, a man who had lived long enough to see that peace and violence were brothers born of the same blood. The West would remember him as a hero. But John Collins would remember himself as something much simpler, a man who just never stopped surviving. He saved towns, buried friends, and carried a name too heavy for any man to hold. But for John "Shotgun" Collins, the legend wasn't the gift. It was the curse. The wind carried dust across the endless plains. Somewhere out there, under a sky heavy with heat, a man rode alone. His name was John Collins, though few used it anymore. To most, he was only Shotgun John, a legend with a bounty on his head and a story twisted by strangers. He had saved towns, stopped raiders, and brought law to lawless places. But the more he helped, the higher the price on his name grew. Every outlaw wanted his head, every bounty hunter wanted his gold, and every lawman wanted him gone. John had become the one thing he never wanted to be, a hunted man. He moved quietly from town to town, never staying long. He slept under the stars, his shotgun never far from reach. Sometimes he'd catch whispers in a saloon, men bragging they'd seen him, others swearing he was dead. But the truth was simpler. He was alive. Tired, yes, but alive. One evening, as he rode through a canyon in West Texas, he saw something that stopped him cold. Pinned to a tree was a wanted poster, his name printed in bold black letters. John "Shotgun" Collins, wanted dead or alive. Reward, $5,000. Below the poster was a seal. Not the mark of an outlaw gang, the seal of the U.S. Marshal's office. John stared at it for a long time, the paper trembling in the wind. The law itself had turned on him. That night he camped beside a dry riverbed. The fire crackled low, throwing shadows across his weathered face. He thought about all he'd done, the people he'd saved, the towns he'd helped, the friends he'd buried. It didn't matter. Out here, the world didn't remember kindness. It remembered gunfire. He whispered to the darkness, "Guess I'm wanted by both heaven and hell now." A few days later, while passing through a small settlement, John overheard talk of bounty men nearby. 3 of them. Ruthless, skilled, and eager for the reward. He could have ridden on. But something in him snapped. Maybe pride, maybe exhaustion. He was tired of running. At sunset, he found them at an abandoned ranch, sitting around a fire, laughing about the man they planned to kill. He approached quietly, the crunch of his boots lost under the wind. "Evening, boys," he said. The laughter died. One of them stood. "You lost, old man?" John leveled his shotgun. "Not anymore." The first blast hit before they could draw. The second echoed through the night like thunder. When the smoke cleared, only one bounty man was left alive. Young, trembling, barely more than a kid. John walked up to him slowly. "Go home, son," he said. "You don't want to live in my shadow." The boy nodded, dropped his pistol, and ran. John reloaded his shotgun and turned away, but his hands were shaking. Not from fear, from something worse. Guilt. Every time he picked up that gun, he lost another piece of himself. He rode south for days, crossing into the edge of Mexico, where the land turned red and the air smelled of salt and iron. There, in a mining camp, he found work guarding shipments. It wasn't glamorous, but it was quiet. The men didn't ask questions, and he didn't offer answers. They called him Mr. Graham, using the name he'd left behind long ago. For a time, it seemed he had escaped the curse of his legend. But peace doesn't last long for a man like John Collins. One night, the camp was attacked, a group of thieves trying to steal gold from the mine. John fought beside the guards, but the bandits were too many. The air filled with gunfire and shouting. As he ducked behind a cart, a familiar voice shouted his name, the name he hadn't heard in years. John Collins, he turned. Standing across the firelight was Marshal Rogers, the same man who had once begged for his help in New Mexico. Now he wore a badge and a gun drawn steady. "By order of the U.S. Marshal's office," Rogers said, "you're under arrest." John lowered his weapon. "You know I didn't do what they say." Rogers hesitated. "Maybe not, but Washington doesn't care. They want the Old West gone, and that means you." John looked around. The burning camp, the screaming men, the falling stars. "You really want to end it here?" he asked softly. For a long moment, Rogers didn't move. Then slowly he holstered his gun. "Get out of here, John! Don't ever come back!" John nodded. "You won't see me again." And with that, he vanished into the desert night, a ghost slipping between the cracks of history. He rode until his horse gave out, then walked until dawn. Somewhere along the border, he stopped, dropped to his knees, and stared at the rising sun. All his life he had fought for something: justice, survival, redemption. But now, for the first time, he didn't know what was left to fight for. He whispered almost to himself, "Maybe the legend dies here." The desert was silent. For months, no one saw him. No one heard the echo of his shotgun or the jingle of his spurs. Stories said he'd gone to Mexico, others claimed he'd been killed by bounty men. But the truth was far quieter. John Collins was still alive, hidden, old, and alone, trying to forget the name that once made him famous. He spent his days repairing fences for strangers, and his nights sitting by the fire, staring at the stars. The man who once fought the chaos of the West now sought peace in its silence, and in that silence, the legend of Shotgun John began to fade. But not disappear. He became a ghost, not because he died, but because he finally chose to live. The world would remember the legend. But somewhere in the quiet desert, the man still breathed. The Mexican sun beat down on the red rocks like a hammer. In a small mining town called Santa Lucia, a gray-haired American worked quietly beside locals who barely knew his name. To them, he was Mr. Graham, a hired guard who kept watch over the gold wagons and never missed a night shift. But beneath the dust and silence, he was still John "Shotgun" Collins, the gunslinger who had walked away from his legend. For the first time in decades, he felt something close to peace. He rose with the sun, drank coffee from a tin cup, and watched the mountains turn pink in the morning light. The miners laughed when he told stories about Texas storms and stampedes. They had no idea those stories were memories. At night he played cards under a lantern, always folding early, always leaving before the arguments started. He had learned that peace was a fragile thing, too loud a word, and it could shatter. When letters from home arrived through travelers, he read them slowly by firelight. Tabitha wrote about the children, the harvest, the quiet of their ranch. She never spoke of the past, and he never asked her to. In her words he found forgiveness, the kind a man like him rarely earned. Sometimes he closed his eyes and imagined riding home again. But each time he opened them, the desert reminded him why he stayed away. One evening, as the miners rested after a long day, a rider appeared on the ridge. Dust followed him like a ghost. He carried no flag, no badge, just a message. When he dismounted, John recognized the look in his eyes. Fear. "You Collins?" the messenger asked. John hesitated. "Not anymore." The rider shook his head. "Doesn't matter. They know you're here. Americans, bounty hunters. 3 of them." John closed his eyes. He'd known this day would come. Legends don't fade. They get chased. He paid the rider for his trouble and watched him ride off into the twilight. Then he walked to his small room, opened the trunk under his bed, and lifted the old shotgun. Dust rose in the air like memory. He ran his fingers along the barrel. "Guess you and me ain't done yet," he murmured. The hunters came at dawn. They rode into Santa Lucia as if the town belonged to them. Spurs jangling, guns gleaming, faces hard from the trail. They headed straight for the mine camp, asking for the American Guard. John saw them coming from the ridge and felt the old instincts wake up inside him. The timing, the calm, the weight of the world shrinking to the length of his gun barrel. He didn't want blood on this ground. Not here. Not where people still believed he was someone good. So he rode down to meet them alone. The leader, a thin man with a scar over one eye, smiled coldly. $5,000 for your head, Collins." "That's worth a trip south." John didn't move. "I ain't the man you're looking for," the scarred man laughed. "You're him, all right. You've got the eyes of a killer." He reached for his gun. The blast from John's shotgun rolled through the valley like thunder. When the smoke cleared, 2 men lay on the ground, and the third was running for his life. The miners came running from the camp, staring in shock. They had never seen their quiet guard like this. Eyes cold, hands steady, standing over the dead with no fear, no words. John looked at them and said softly, "They came for me." "Not for you. This place ain't safe no more." That night, he packed his saddle and left Santa Lucia without a goodbye. The men he saved never forgot him. In their stories, he became something almost holy, a wandering spirit who appeared when evil came and vanished when it was gone. John rode west through the mountains until he reached a small village near the Sonoran Desert. There he found work fixing wells and building fences for a widow and her 2 sons. For a while, life felt normal again. The boys followed him everywhere, asking about Texas and the cowboys they'd heard of. He told them only one thing: don't grow up wanting to be a gunman. It don't end the way you think. They laughed, thinking he was joking. But the look in his eyes said he wasn't. In the quiet evenings, he helped them tend the animals and watch the sun sink behind the mountains. Sometimes he'd look up at the sky and whisper Tabitha's name, as if the wind could carry it back home. He was older now, slower, but there was a strange peace in the wrinkles around his eyes. Maybe, he thought, this is how it ends, not with gunfire, but with quiet. Then one morning, a rider from the north brought news that shattered that peace. He spoke Spanish slowly, carefully. "Senor Graham, your ranch in Texas, your family, trouble, bandits." John froze. The fire in his heart, the one he'd spent years trying to bury, roared back to life. Without a word, he went to his room, opened the chest, and took out the old shotgun one last time. He checked the barrels, loaded 2 shells, and closed it with a click that echoed through the small house like a clock striking midnight. The widow watched from the door. "You are leaving?" John nodded. There are things a man can run from his whole life. Family ain't one of them. He saddled his horse, tipped his hat to the boys, and rode north. The road to Texas was long and lonely. He was old, but his mind was sharp and his purpose clear. Each mile took him closer to the past he had tried to forget. As the border came into view, he saw the distant blue hills of home and felt something deep in his chest, a mix of fear, hope, and finality. He didn't know what waited for him. But he knew this: whatever was coming, he would face it not as a legend, not as a ghost, but as a man. The desert had given him peace. Now the West was calling him home. And for John Collins, every road back home led through gunsmoke. The Texas border stretched before him like a line between 2 worlds, the man he had been and the man he was about to become again. John Collins rode through the dry wind with nothing but a horse, a half-empty canteen, and the weight of a past that refused to die. For days he followed the old trails he once rode as a young man. The landscape was different now. Fences had replaced open plains. Towns had grown where only campfires used to burn. But the air still carried the same sound, the endless whistle of the wind and the quiet hum of danger. He crossed the Rio Grande at dawn. The water was shallow, but the memory ran deep. Each splash of the horse's hooves brought back faces he'd tried to forget. Friends, enemies, men who'd lived and died by the same code he once did. By the time he reached the outskirts of Uvalde, the sun was sinking, painting the sky in orange and red. He hadn't seen the town in years. It was bigger now. New buildings, new people, but the same dust on every window. He tied his horse outside the saloon and stepped through the doors. The room fell silent. The barkeep stared for a long moment, then whispered, "I'll be damned." "Shotgun John." John shook his head slowly. "Just Collins." The barkeep nodded nervously. "Sure, Collins. Whatever you say." He poured a drink and slid it across the counter. "Heard about what happened out near your ranch. Bandits from the border, nasty bunch, took over the place 3 days ago. Sheriff tried to ride out, but he never came back." John's jaw tightened. "My family?" The barkeep hesitated. "They're alive. For now." John set the glass down untouched. For now was enough to make his blood run cold. That night he rode to the ridge overlooking his land. The moonlight revealed the outline of his old ranch, fences broken, smoke rising from the barn, and shadows moving by the house. There were 6 of them, maybe 7. He counted by habit, his mind sharp as ever. They were armed, drunk, and loud. He dismounted quietly, checking his shotgun. 2 shells loaded. 2 more in his coat pocket. That was all. From the hill, he could see the flicker of firelight through the window. Tabitha and the children were inside. He could almost hear their voices. The sound hit him harder than any bullet ever could. He crouched behind a fence post and whispered to himself, "One last time." The first man never saw him coming. John moved like a shadow, silent and precise. One blast from the shotgun and the outlaw dropped without a sound. The others shouted, fumbling for their guns, the calm night exploding into chaos. John fired again, smoke curling from the barrels, the recoil steady in his hands. The bandits scattered, shooting wild into the dark. He reloaded, ducked behind the trough, and waited. Footsteps crunched in the dirt behind him. He swung the shotgun fast, too fast for the young outlaw who'd tried to sneak up on him. The shot tore through the night. When the smoke cleared, only 2 men remained, one hiding behind the wagon, the other standing on the porch with a pistol to Tabitha's head. John froze. The man on the porch grinned. "Put it down, old man, or she dies." The shotgun hung heavy in John's hands. His heart pounded. He'd faced death 100 times, but never like this. "Don't," Tabitha whispered. "Don't give him the chance." The bandit laughed, pressing the gun closer to her temple. "You think you're a legend, Collins? You're just another ghost." John took a slow breath, then did something no one expected. He dropped the shotgun. The outlaw smirked, stepping closer. "That's right. Legends end like everyone else." Then, in one swift move, John kicked the shotgun up from the dirt, caught it midair, and fired. The flash lit up the porch like lightning. The outlaw fell backward, his gun tumbling into the dust. The last man turned to run, but John didn't chase. He just called out, "Tell them all, Shotgun John's done." There's nothing left to hunt. The man didn't look back. He just kept running into the darkness. The night went quiet again. Smoke drifted across the yard, mixing with the smell of gunpowder and burned wood. John walked slowly up the porch steps. Tabitha was shaking, but alive. Their eldest son stood behind her, pale, clutching a rifle he'd never fired. John set the shotgun down on the porch and knelt, his breath heavy, his eyes full of tears he'd been holding back for years. "It's over," he whispered. Tabitha knelt beside him, placing a trembling hand on his shoulder. "It's never over, John, but you came back." He nodded weakly. "I told you I would." At dawn, the sheriff and a few men from town arrived. They found bodies scattered around the yard and John Collins sitting on the steps, cleaning the soot from his hands. "You took out a whole gang," the sheriff said in disbelief. John just looked out toward the rising sun. "Did what I had to," the sheriff sighed. "They'll be talking about this for years." John gave a tired half smile. "That's the problem." Later that morning, he walked to the barn, where the shotgun lay across a workbench. He picked it up one last time, running his hand along the barrel. It had been his companion, his curse, his salvation. He set it down carefully and said softly, "Rest now." Then he walked out into the sunlight, where his family waited. Not a legend, not an outlaw, just a man who had finally come home. He fought his last fight not for gold or glory, but for love. And that's what made him truly free. John Collins didn't die that night. He just stopped running. The days that followed were quiet. Too quiet for a man who'd lived most of his life by the sound of gunfire. John Collins woke each morning to the smell of coffee, the laughter of his children, and the low hum of cattle out in the field. The land had scars, burned fences, broken gates, but it was alive. His family was alive. For the first time in decades, peace wasn't something he chased. It was something that sat beside him on the porch, watching the sun rise over the hills. He'd thought coming home would be hard. It wasn't. The hard part was learning how to live like a man who didn't have to look over his shoulder. He rebuilt the barn himself, board by board. Every hammer strike was like a heartbeat returning to life. His sons helped, though they still watched him with a strange kind of awe, the kind reserved for heroes in stories. He didn't want to be a story. He wanted to be a father, a husband, a man who could walk into town and buy supplies without whispers following him, but the whispers never stopped. Shotgun John's back, they'd say in the saloon. Took down a whole gang by himself. Some said he was still dangerous. Others said he was cursed. John ignored it all. He'd learned that legends have long shadows, and you can't hide from your own. Weeks turned into months. The ranch healed, so did he. The children grew. The land greened after the spring rains, and life, real, quiet life, began to take shape again. Yet some nights, when the wind blew through the trees, Tabitha would find him sitting by the window awake, staring at the moon. "Can't sleep?" she'd whisper. He'd shake his head. Old ghosts don't like silence. She'd sit beside him, her hand resting on his, and together they'd listen to the night. One afternoon, a familiar sound came down the road, the jingle of spurs, the creak of saddles. Two riders approached the ranch, dust swirling around their horses. John stepped outside, hand resting on his belt, but no weapon there. He'd left the shotgun inside, locked away. The men stopped near the fence. One wore a badge, the other a black hat that shaded eyes filled with unease. "Morning," John said calmly. The sheriff nodded. "Morning, Collins. We heard what happened out here. You saved your family, saved the town too. Folks want to thank you." John smiled faintly. "I don't need thanks. Just quiet." The sheriff hesitated. "There's talk from Austin. Word of a pardon, maybe even a medal. For what you've done." John shook his head. "Medals belong to soldiers. I'm just a man who finally came home." The sheriff looked at him for a moment, then tipped his hat. "You've earned your peace, John. Don't let anyone take it." As the riders left, Tabitha came to the porch. "What did they want?" "Just ghosts," he said softly. "The world still can't let them rest." Summer came. The land bloomed again. John spent his days tending cattle and teaching his youngest son how to ride. Sometimes the boy asked about the old days, the gunfights, the adventures. John never lied, but he never glorified them either. "Did you really fight bandits and outlaws?" the boy asked one evening. John smiled gently. "I fought men who were lost. Sometimes I was one of them." The boy thought for a moment. "Are you still?" John looked out at the horizon. Not anymore. As the years passed, the legend of Shotgun John faded into story. New towns rose, new heroes took his place. The Old West he knew was dying, replaced by fences and laws and railroads. He didn't mind. The world was finally growing out of its gun belt, and that was how it should be. He grew older, slower, but his eyes still carried the same steady calm. The shotgun stayed locked away, untouched, a relic of another life. Sometimes travelers stopped by, asking for tales of the man he used to be. He always said the same thing: stories are just smoke. They fade when the wind changes. One autumn evening, John sat on the porch watching the sunset. The sky was red and gold, the same colors it had been on the day he first picked up a gun. Tabitha sat beside him, knitting quietly. Their children were grown, scattered across Texas. The house was peaceful again, filled with silence that didn't ache anymore. He took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the light on his face. "You ever think we made it too far?" he asked softly. Tabitha smiled. "No one makes it too far, John. They just make it home." He nodded, eyes still on the horizon. The light dimmed, slowly turning the world to silver. He leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and let the sound of crickets and wind lull him into stillness. That night, John Collins passed quietly in his sleep. No gunfire, no storm, no legend's farewell. Just peace. When the sun rose the next morning, Tabitha found him there, still holding her hand. She didn't cry right away. She just sat beside him and whispered, "You kept your promise. You came back." They buried him under the oak tree behind the house, beside the shotgun he had carried all his life. On the wooden cross above his grave, she carved the words herself. John Collins, husband, father, man of peace. Years later, travelers passing through Uvalde would still hear the stories about the gunslinger who fought for justice, who vanished, and who finally found his way home. But those who truly knew him said something different. They said the West didn't make John Collins a legend. It made him human. In the end, it wasn't the gun that defined him. It was the man who laid it down. Years passed. The ranch grew quiet again. The fences weathered, the barn faded to gray, and the oak tree by the house spread its branches wide over the earth where John Collins rested. Tabitha lived out her days on that land. She never remarried. Every evening she sat on the porch where her husband had taken his last breath, watching the same sunsets he once loved. Sometimes travelers stopped by, strangers chasing rumors of Shotgun John, hoping to find the grave of a legend. They always found Tabitha instead. She'd smile kindly, offer them water, and listen to their wild stories about her husband. How he'd once fought 50 men, how he'd robbed trains, or how he'd been faster than lightning. When they finished, she'd shake her head and say, "He wasn't a hero and he wasn't a killer. He was just a man who learned too late that peace is the hardest fight of all." And then she'd point toward the oak tree and say softly, "If you came looking for the legend, he's gone. But if you came looking for the man, he's right there." Over time, even those stories began to fade. The Old West itself was dying. Railroads stretched across the plains, telegraphs replaced couriers, and the law came not from the barrel of a gun, but from the ink of a pen. The world moved on. But every so often, someone would find his name written in an old newspaper or carved into the handle of a rusted shotgun, and they'd wonder, who was Shotgun John Collins? And somewhere, deep in the heart of Texas, the wind still seemed to whisper the answer. Decades later, when the ranch finally passed into other hands, the new owners discovered a box hidden beneath the floorboards of the old house. Inside was a worn leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. The handwriting was rough, but the words were steady. "To whoever finds this, my name was Abraham Graham, though most knew me as John Collins. I lived many lives and made more mistakes than I can count. I fought for gold, for survival, for others, and sometimes for nothing at all. I buried good men and carried bad memories. But if there's one thing I learned, it's this: a man isn't what he was called. He's what he chooses to become when the dust finally settles." There was no signature, just the faint outline of a thumbprint pressed into the paper long ago. Historians would later piece together fragments of his story, old records, witness accounts, whispers in forgotten saloons. Some called him a lawman. Others said he was an outlaw turned savior. But those who looked deeper realized something else. Every version of his life told a different truth. Maybe that was the point, because in the end, the story of John Collins wasn't about fame or violence, it was about transformation. A man who walked through chaos and came out the other side with his humanity still intact. And that, more than any duel or gunfight, made him legendary. In 1922, when the local paper wrote a short piece about the mysterious death of an aging rancher once known as Shotgun John, the editor closed with a single line. "He lived like the wind, sometimes calm, sometimes violent, but always moving toward something better." That line would later appear on a plaque placed near his grave. Long after Tabitha passed on, visitors still come. Some are historians, some are wanderers, some are just dreamers who grew up reading about the Wild West. They leave coins, bullets, and small wooden carvings on the stone. No one knows who started the tradition, But it continues, as if each traveler feels a quiet connection to the man who fought his way out of myth to become something real. Sometimes, in the stillness of early morning when the mist clings to the grass and the first light hits the old ranch, it's said you can hear the faint echo of a voice. Low, calm, steady. Don't chase the legend, kid. Live your own. Generations later, his great-grandchildren would learn the truth of who he was. They'd grow up hearing bedtime stories not about a gunslinger, but about a man who found redemption in the very land that once nearly destroyed him. One of them, a young woman named Sarah, would go on to write a book titled The Quiet West. The true story of John "Shotgun" Collins. It would remind the world that not all heroes wear badges, and not all villains wear black. Some are just men caught in the middle, doing what they must to survive. The book became a modest success, and with it, the legend of John Collins came full circle, from outlaw to savior to forgotten name, and finally to a story that spoke of forgiveness. In the end, history remembered him not for how many men he fought, but for how many he spared. Not for the battles he won, but for the peace he chose. He was proof that even in the darkest corners of the Wild West, redemption was possible. They say the Wild West made legends out of men who carried guns. But John Collins showed that the truest kind of courage isn't in the fight. It's in laying the gun down when the world still expects you to draw. The wind moves through the grass. The oak tree stands tall, and under its shade, a simple wooden marker remains, the final resting place of a man who outlived his myth. John "Shotgun" Collins, the legend who found peace.